It was Christmas Eve in a small town nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado, where the snow was thick and the streets quiet. The Turner family was just finishing their Christmas dinner, enjoying the warmth of the fire as they exchanged small gifts. It was Christmas Eve in a small town nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado, where the snow was thick and the streets quiet. The Turner family was just finishing their Christmas dinner, enjoying the warmth of the fire as they exchanged small gifts. It all started a few days earlier, when Mrs. Turner noticed a faint scratching sound coming from the attic at night. She assumed it was just a squirrel or some other small animal trying to get in out of the cold. But the noises grew louder each night, and eventually they started to happen during the day. Her husband, Frank, went up to check but found nothing. No animals, no signs of any intrusion. Still, the scratching persisted. As the days passed, the Turners tried to brush it off, attributing it to the stresses of the holiday season. But things got even stranger. The family's Christmas tree, which they had just decorated, started losing ornaments every morning. It wasn't just that they fell off. It was as if someone had deliberately taken them and hidden them in strange places. The ornaments would show up in the most unusual spots: on the back porch, in the bathroom, or even under the couch cushions. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered in the living room, surrounded by gifts and the soft glow of the tree lights. Frank sat back in his armchair, sipping his eggnog, while Mrs. Turner busied herself with the children, making sure they were ready for bed. It was the first peaceful moment they'd had in days. But just as they were settling into their holiday routine, the doorbell rang. It was odd, considering they were miles away from their nearest neighbor. Frank stood up, puzzled, and walked to the door. When he opened it, no one was there. Only a small package lay on the doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper with a single red ribbon tied around it. There was no return address, no note attached, just the package. His gut twisted with unease, but he brought it inside, hoping it was some sort of prank. Inside the package was a small wooden box. When they opened it, they found a single, old-fashioned ornament, a glass bauble, cracked and covered in dust. The sight of it sent a cold chill through Mrs. Turner, but Frank laughed it off. Still, they decided to hang the ornament on the tree, curious about its origins. As soon as it touched the branches, the room grew suddenly cold, and the lights on the tree flickered. The air felt heavy, and a strange pressure built in their chests. The children didn't seem to notice, too caught up in their excitement for Santa's arrival, but Mrs. Turner felt something was terribly wrong. She urged her family to go to bed early, but no one could sleep. Every time they tried, the scratching noises from the attic grew louder, until it sounded as though something was pacing up there. Frank decided to confront it again, but when he reached the attic, he found nothing. No animals, no intruders, just the oppressive silence of the cold, empty space. Later that night, as the family lay in their beds, they heard footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate steps. They echoed down the hallway, coming closer and closer to their rooms. At first, they thought it was just the wind, or maybe one of the children sleepwalking. But when the door to the bedroom creaked open, there was nothing there. Only a cold draft that made their breath visible in the air. The scratching continued, and soon the entire family was awake, too terrified to sleep. As they huddled together in the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening, the Christmas tree lights began to flicker once more. But this time they didn't just flicker. They went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. For a few seconds no one moved, and then from the darkness they heard a soft whisper. It was barely audible, but they all heard it. "Merry Christmas." Frank grabbed a flashlight, his hands shaking, and turned it toward the tree. To his horror, the small wooden ornament, the one they had received earlier, was now gone. They searched the room frantically, but it had vanished. The scratching from the attic had stopped, replaced by the sound of something shifting in the corner of the room. They turned slowly, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, dressed in old-fashioned winter clothes, and wearing a thick black mask. Before they could react, the figure stepped forward and placed the ornament back on the tree. The lights flickered again, this time coming back on full force. The room grew warm, the oppressive feeling lifting as quickly as it had come. The figure nodded, then turned and walked toward the door. As it opened, the cold wind rushed in, and the door slammed shut behind it. The family was left in stunned silence, They had no explanation for what they had just witnessed. Frank rushed to the door, flinging it open to find nothing but the heavy snowfall outside. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone coming or going. They had not imagined it. The figure had been real. The next day, when the snow had cleared, Frank went outside to check the yard. He noticed something strange, fresh, deep footprints leading up to the house, but they stopped just at the door, as if the person had vanished into thin air. His skin prickled with dread as he walked back inside. The Turners never spoke of that night again. They moved away from the house a few weeks later, unable to shake the eerie feeling that still lingered in the air. The house was eventually sold to another family, but the strange happenings continued. Neighbors later reported hearing scratching noises in the attic, and some claimed to have seen a tall, masked figure in the yard late at night. To this day, no one knows who or what visited the Turner family that Christmas Eve. Some say it was the spirit of an old man, cursed to wander the earth, while others believe it was something much darker. But every Christmas, the people in that small town hear the faintest sound of scratching in the distance, a chilling reminder that some things are better left unexplained. A Christmas Eve snowstorm had blanketed the small New England town, making everything seem eerily silent. Emily, a local school teacher, had just finished attending the town's annual Christmas play. As she drove home, her car slid slightly on the icy roads, but she regained control. Suddenly, she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, wearing an old-fashioned Santa suit. His face was obscured by shadows, making him look even more mysterious. Emily's heart raced as she slammed on the brakes. The car came to a halt just in time, but when she looked up again, the figure was gone. She shook her head, chalking it up to fatigue. However, a strange unease crept into her. It felt like someone was watching her from the darkness outside. She arrived home, but the usual warmth of her little house didn't ease her nerves. Something was off. As Emily stepped inside, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. She was certain she had locked it before leaving. Her stomach twisted, but she reassured herself it was probably just the wind. She checked the house room by room, finding nothing out of place. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, she double-checked the locks before going to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, Emily woke up to the faint sound of footsteps on the roof. At first, she thought it was a tree branch, but the rhythm of the steps felt deliberate, as if someone were walking. Her pulse quickened as she strained to hear over the howling wind. She nervously approached the window, but the snowstorm made it impossible to see anything outside. The next morning, Emily noticed strange tracks in the fresh snow leading away from her house. They were large and odd, not quite human nor animal. She followed them into the woods, but they abruptly stopped. Uneasy, she decided not to mention it to anyone, convincing herself it was a prank or her overactive imagination. But she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was very wrong. That evening, the power went out. Her house was suddenly pitch black, save for the glow of the fireplace. Emily's phone was dead, and the landline had been out for weeks. The silence felt oppressive. Just as she was about to sit down, a soft knock came at the door. It was slow and deliberate, almost like a warning. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She called out, but there was no answer. Trembling, Emily slowly approached the door and peered through the peephole. She saw nothing but swirling snow. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. In a panic, she opened the door just a crack, only to find a small wrapped gift box on the porch. Her hands shook as she picked it up and brought it inside. Inside the box was a tarnished bell, small and old-looking. A note attached to it read, "To Emily, you've been chosen." Her heart skipped a beat. Who had left this? Who knew her name? She quickly slammed the door shut, locking it and bolting it tight. The bell, though small, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. She didn't want to touch it, but she couldn't resist. The sound it made when she shook it sent a chill down her spine. That night, Emily had a strange dream. She saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, holding the bell. The figure whispered her name, but the words sounded wrong, like they were coming from the bell itself. Emily woke up in a cold sweat, and when she turned to her nightstand, the bell was there. It hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Panic surged through her as she realized it had somehow moved. Days passed, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. Windows she had locked were found open. She could smell pine in rooms she hadn't entered. The footprints continued to circle her house, always vanishing before they reached the edge of her property. Emily tried to tell her friends, but they laughed it off, thinking it was just the stress of the holidays. But Emily knew something was terribly wrong. On Christmas Eve, the air grew even colder. Emily sat in front of the fire, trying to calm her nerves. Suddenly, she heard the faint sound of sleigh bells from outside. It wasn't cheerful like the jingles of Christmas. It was slow, deliberate, and ominous. The bells grew louder, and with a jolt of fear, Emily realized they were coming closer. She rushed to the window but saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him, the figure in the Santa suit. He was standing in the yard, staring up at her window. His face was completely hidden in shadow, and his eyes, if they existed, seemed to pierce through the darkness. His smile was twisted, too wide to be human. The bell in his hand jangled in the night, the sound sending a wave of dread through Emily. Frantic, Emily grabbed her coat and ran outside. The snow seemed to be falling heavier now, but there was no sign of the man. The bell continued to ring in the distance, growing louder and louder. Emily looked around, but the figure had vanished, leaving only the eerie jingle echoing in her mind. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just a bad dream. The following day, Emily decided to leave the town. She couldn't take it anymore, but as she packed her things, the sound of sleigh bells grew louder. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind, but it sounded closer now. Suddenly, the engine in her car sputtered and died, stranding her in the middle of nowhere. She looked around, her heart racing, and then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow. Emily looked out of the car window and saw the figure standing there once more, holding the bell. This time his face was even more grotesque, empty, hollow eyes, and that twisted grin. He raised the bell, shaking it once. The sound echoed in her ears, deafening her. She screamed, but no one could hear her. The figure stepped forward, and in that moment, Emily knew she was not going to make it out. The next morning, the car was found, buried in snow. The door was wide open, but there was no sign of Emily. Only a single set of large footprints led away from the vehicle, disappearing into the forest. No one in the town spoke of it much after that. People just whispered about the strange happenings, and the legend of Emily and the Phantom Santa became part of the town's folklore. Years passed, but the stories didn't fade. Locals still claimed to hear sleigh bells on Christmas Eve, often followed by the chilling sound of footsteps in the snow. Some said it was the spirit of a man who had lost his family during the holidays and now sought others to take their place. Others believed it was a demonic entity, punishing those who dared to disturb the peace of Christmas. Whatever the truth, the legend grew, and every Christmas Eve a strange figure would appear in the snow, leaving behind the same tarnished bell. No one ever saw him approach or leave, and the bell's jingle would echo in the distance, a reminder of the danger that lurked in the quiet of the holiday season. For those who dared to listen, the faint sound of the bells would haunt them throughout the year, growing louder as Christmas approached. Some say that on the coldest nights, you can still hear Emily's screams, carried on the wind. The bell's toll is a reminder that some traditions are best left undisturbed. And so, the small New England town remains silent on Christmas Eve, except for the sound of distant sleigh bells. The legend of the Phantom Santa continues to be passed down, and those who hear it know better than to ask questions. They know that the figure in the Santa suit is not someone who should ever be followed. The bell's toll is the last warning, the whisper in the dark. "You're not alone," the sibilant voice seemed to say. Alice froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She looked toward the dark corners, but saw nothing except the shadows of her own room. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind or maybe some strange noise from outside. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. It was a cold, dark night when Alice settled into her bed, hoping the exhaustion from the past few weeks would quickly lull her to sleep. The strong wind howled through the windows, and the sound of leaves tapping against the house created an unsettling atmosphere. She'd always been a rational person, but something about these cold nights made her feel strangely watched. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 in the morning. Alice tried to turn on her side, dismissing the weight of an odd sensation, as if something was in the shadows of the room. She convinced herself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on her mind. But the faint whisper that came from the dark corner of the room made her heart stop for a moment. The whisper didn't stop. It was as if it was coming from somewhere inside the walls, close to her, but without a visible source. Alice got up, her pulse quickening, turning off the reading lamp, trying to sink into total darkness so she could focus better. But the sensation of being watched only intensified. She looked at the door to the room, trying to see any movement. The sound of leaves outside mixed with the beating of her own heart. The fear started to take over her mind, but she forced herself to walk over to the window. She tried to calm herself, telling herself she was just overloaded with work and that all of this was just a hallucination. Back in bed, the whisper stopped for a moment. Alice allowed herself to close her eyes, trying to convince herself that she was imagining everything. But before she could relax, something moved quickly in the corner of the room. She looked immediately, but whatever had been there was gone. Only silence remained. Minutes felt like hours, and Alice's fear grew with each passing second. The room seemed smaller, as if the walls were closing in around her. She heard the whisper again, much closer now, almost as if it were in her ear. "Don't ignore what I'm saying," the voice seemed to beg, slithering like a snake. Alice curled up, pulling the covers up to her neck. The whisper followed her thoughts, as if someone was inside her mind, speaking directly to her. She tried to ignore it, closing her eyes tightly, but the murmurs persisted, building pressure in her head. The sensation of being watched refused to go away. She got up again, running into the hallway. Everything was silent out there, but the fear still wrapped itself around her. The house seemed larger than ever, with the shadows playing on the walls. Back in her room, Alice lay down, trying to find some peace. But just as she was about to close her eyes, the voice returned. "I've always been here." Desperate, Alice searched the house but found nothing but the echo of her own footsteps. When she returned to her room, the door was slightly open, as if someone had entered. She quickly shut it, feeling a chill run down her spine. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the mirror, there was a dark silhouette reflected behind her. The reflection moved as if it were watching Alice, but when she turned to look, no one was there. Her heart raced, and she could no longer tell if what she was seeing was real or just a manifestation of her fear. She looked at the mirror again, and this time, the silhouette was closer. With a shock, Alice jumped back, knocking over a chair. The sound of the furniture hitting the floor seemed to amplify the silence in the house. The silhouette vanished instantly from the mirror, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Alice didn't know what to do anymore. She felt as if she were trapped in an endless nightmare. She tried to call out for someone, but her voice failed her. Her lips barely formed a sound. Whatever was there seemed to be feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each breath she took. With every involuntary movement, the presence seemed to grow, surrounding her. Alice felt that if she closed her eyes, she might never open them again. She began to think about everything that could have attracted this thing. Maybe it was the old story her grandmother had told her about spirits haunting abandoned places. Or maybe it was something else. Alice tried to focus, trying to rationalize, but the voice inside her head kept growing louder. "You knew I'd be waiting." Suddenly, the wooden floor creaked. Alice looked down at the foot of the bed, her entire body frozen in fear. Something was crawling underneath the mattress, moving slowly, as if it were patient, waiting for the right moment. The sound continued, growing louder, until she saw the bed dip slightly, as though someone was getting up from beneath it. Alice screamed, but it was muffled. She tried to run to the door, but her legs wouldn't obey her. The sensation of paralysis took over her body, as if an invisible force was holding her in place. She looked back, and in that moment of pure terror, she saw a hand emerge from under the bed, long, thin fingers gripping the mattress tightly. She tried to scream again, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The hand kept climbing up, and Alice felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if the hand were an extension of the darkness itself, something that didn't belong to this world. When she finally managed to move, she bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind her. The room was now immersed in a deadly silence. but Alice knew it wasn't over. The sensation of being watched still clung to her. She pressed her back against the door, breathing heavily, her eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Only darkness. When she thought she could finally relax, the mirror in her room began to fog up. Slowly, a figure appeared on the glass, reflecting back at her. The silhouette was indistinct, but somehow it seemed human, with a distorted form, almost as if it were writhing. The figure moved, becoming clearer, with dark eyes fixed on her. Alice tried to look at the mirror rationally, trying to see her own reflection, but she couldn't distinguish what was real anymore. The figure seemed more and more alive, its eyes glowing with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She didn't know what it was, but one thing was clear. It wanted something from her. The figure in the mirror began moving faster now, as if it were trying to break free from the glass. Alice stepped back, but her legs were weak and she could barely stand. The walls of the room seemed to close in around her, as the sound of invisible footsteps echoed. "I can hear you," the figure said, its voice now audible and clearer than ever. Alice's fear reached its peak. She no longer knew what to do. It was as if reality itself was disintegrating around her. The shadows stretched and formed new shapes. Everything seemed distorted, unreal. She looked at herself in the mirror again, and this time, she saw something that made her freeze. Her own eyes were black, just like the figure's. Desperate, Alice tried to scream, but her voice was gone. She felt her cold hands touching her own skin, as if she were trying to understand herself in a reflection that no longer belonged to her. The figure in the mirror came closer, its hands almost touching her neck. "You'll never escape," it whispered. The smile was wicked, and somehow it felt like a death sentence. Alice turned toward the door, trying to open it, but she couldn't. It was locked. Panic took over her, and she felt an immense weight on her chest. The figure moved closer, its laugh echoing in the air. Alice knew she couldn't hold on much longer. She was being swallowed by the darkness, with no chance of escape. And just when she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, she saw a faint light at the end of the hallway. It was a dim light, but enough for her to believe there might be a way out. Without hesitation, Alice ran toward the light, ignoring everything around her. But as she got closer, the light began to fade as though it were being consumed by the darkness. With one last breath of hope, Alice tried to pass through the door leading to the light, but she was pulled back. The hands of the figure intertwined around her body, holding her in a cold embrace. The presence in her mind crushed her, and the darkness enveloped her completely. She was no longer Alice, but something shapeless, lost forever. And so, Alice's story came to an end. There was no one left to tell what had happened in that house, or about the figure that took her. Those who dared to enter the same room, years later, still felt her presence, the whisper in the dark, waiting for another victim. The house, with its distorted shadows, waited for the next visitor. But who knows? Maybe Alice is still there, waiting in some dark corner, watching, observing. Who knows? Maybe you, who read this story, are the next to feel the chill she felt. Maybe the darkness has found a new home. And the next time you're alone at night, hearing the whisper of the wind, remember, it could be her, waiting to tell your story. The wind outside began to pick up, howling louder than ever, like a warning. The trees swayed, and the branches scratched against the windows. The house felt colder now, darker, as if something inside was stirring, waiting for its next victim. But the worst part was that the whisper was growing again, rising in pitch, desperate. No one would ever know what really happened to Alice in that house. But the house itself seemed to remember, and over time more stories began to surface, stories of strange noises, inexplicable shadows, and eerie whispers. Those who dared to visit after Alice's disappearance always felt something was wrong. The house was never quite empty, and neither was Alice. The light in the rear view was now blinding, and it seemed to be coming straight for him. Jack's heart raced, and he slammed his foot on the gas, trying to outrun it. But no matter how fast he went, the light remained right behind him, growing ever brighter. It wasn't a vehicle, it was something else, something unnatural. Jack's pulse quickened as the light continued to close in on him. He tried switching lanes, but no matter where he went, it followed. His headlights cast long, haunting shadows across the empty road, and the truck's engine roared in defiance of the strange force chasing him. The air in the cab grew cold, and the static on the radio became deafening. Suddenly the light flickered and dimmed, only to reappear directly in front of him. Jack slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt. The headlights of his rig illuminated the dark figure that stood in the middle of the highway. A man, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes and a pale, gaunt face. His clothes were torn, and his skin appeared to be decaying. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at Jack through the windshield. He couldn't bring himself to look away, feeling as though something was pulling him in. He tried to honk the horn to drive away, but his truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, as if the very presence of this figure had drained all power from it. Jack was trapped. The figure didn't approach. It didn't need to. Its eyes burned into him, and Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but before he could open the door, the figure was gone, vanished into the night air without a trace. The silence that followed was deafening. The engine sputtered again, and with a jerk the truck started. Jack quickly put it in gear and sped off, leaving the spot where the figure had stood far behind. But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. He glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. But there was nothing. As the miles passed, Jack's nerves slowly began to calm. He told himself it was just some bizarre hallucination, brought on by fatigue or stress. He rolled down the window, letting the cool night air wash over him. But as the wind blew, he heard something, a faint whisper in the breeze just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like a voice calling his name. His heart skipped a beat, and he slammed the window shut. The whispering stopped, but the feeling of dread remained. The road ahead seemed darker now, more oppressive, as if the very asphalt was alive, watching him. Jack shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. He couldn't afford to let his mind play tricks on him. He had a job to do. Minutes passed, then hours. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd driven this far without seeing a single other vehicle on the road. It was as if the world had emptied out, leaving only him, his truck, and the desolate highway. He turned on the radio again, hoping for some distraction, but it was still filled with nothing but static. Out of nowhere, a shape appeared in the distance, a faint figure walking along the side of the road. Jack's heart raced again as he approached, slowing down to get a better look. The figure was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore a heavy jacket, despite the warm night, and his face was obscured by the brim of his hat. Jack felt a strange compulsion to stop, to offer the man a ride, but something deep inside told him not to. As he neared, the man lifted his head, revealing pale, hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. The figure raised a hand, gesturing for Jack to stop, but Jack quickly swerved around him, his tires skidding on the asphalt. He drove faster now, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The headlights of his truck illuminated the road ahead, but the shadows on the sides seemed to stretch and bend, as though they were alive. The air in the cab was thick, suffocating. Jack's breath became shallow, and he began to feel dizzy, as though something was sapping his strength. The radio crackled to life, the static giving way to a low, garbled voice. Jack could barely make out the words, but it sounded like a warning. "Turn back. Don't go any further." The voice repeated over and over again, growing more urgent with each passing second. His hands trembled as he turned the dial, but the voice didn't stop. His truck swerved, the road bending in strange, unnatural ways. The scenery around him seemed to warp, as if the world itself was collapsing in on him. Jack's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. He had been driving this route for years. Nothing like this had ever happened before. A flash of light blinded him. Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. The figure from earlier, the gaunt man, was standing in the middle of the road again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of pale, twisted shapes surrounded him, all staring at Jack with glowing eyes. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, a dark energy emanating from the figures. Jack felt the air grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. His breath fogged up in the cab as he stared in horror at the creatures surrounding his truck. He knew they weren't human, not anymore. They were something else, something ancient and evil. The truck's lights flickered and died, plunging him into total darkness. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for the keys. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he couldn't seem to get a grip. The creatures were closer now, their glowing eyes the only light in the pitch-black night. One of them stepped forward, its features twisted and grotesque, its mouth a gaping, empty void. It reached out a hand, touching the windshield, and a chill ran down Jack's spine. He tried to start the truck again, but it wouldn't turn over. The engine was dead, he was trapped, and the creatures were closing in. The figure from earlier, the gaunt man, stepped forward once more. His eyes glowed even brighter now, and Jack felt a sudden rush of fear as the man spoke. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice cold and hollow. "You're ours now." Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was paralyzed, frozen in place. The creature's eyes bored into him, and Jack felt a strange pull, like an invisible force drawing him out of the truck. He fought against it, but his body refused to obey. The man smiled, showing sharp, jagged teeth, and then reached for Jack. The air around him crackled with dark energy, the temperature plunging further. Just when he thought he couldn't fight it any longer, the figure stopped. It looked up, its eyes widening in fear. The creatures around him recoiled, as if something was approaching. Jack didn't understand what was happening, but he felt a sudden surge of energy. The truck's engine roared to life once more, and the lights flickered back on. The creatures screamed, their voices high-pitched and shrill as they retreated into the darkness. The gaunt man turned and ran, his form dissolving into the night as if it were never there. Jack's hands were still trembling, but he slammed his foot on the gas, speeding away from the terrifying scene. He didn't look back. Jack drove faster, not daring to stop until the sun finally began to rise. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the world seemed to return to normal. The road ahead was clear, the shadows no longer twisted and menacing. Jack felt a strange sense of relief, but he knew deep down that the terror wasn't over. He pulled into a truck stop, his heart still racing. The others there barely noticed him as he stumbled out of the truck, shaking. A fellow trucker looked at him with a knowing glance as if he'd seen this before. "You saw them too, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Jack nodded, too shaken to speak. The trucker sighed, his face grim. "They're always out there waiting. They don't stop. No one really leaves that road." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, the weight of the truth sinking in. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The highway had its own rules, and they were never kind. Jack never drove that route again. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the night, he hears the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder. "You're ours now." And he knows deep down that the highway will always be waiting for him, just like it waits for every other soul foolish enough to drive its cursed path. The Silent Watcher. The killings had stopped years ago, but the town still lived in fear of his return. No one had ever found out who he was, or why he'd chosen his victims. All they knew was that they were all alone when he came for them. Each victim had been found in their homes, the doors locked, no signs of forced entry. They died quietly, without a struggle. Lena had always been curious. Growing up in a small town, she often found herself reading through the old newspapers, fascinated by the stories of missing persons and unsolved mysteries. But one case always stood out, the case of the Silent Watcher. No one knew his real name. He was just a name in the files, a ghost who haunted the shadows. Lena couldn't help but obsess over the case. She was a journalist, and the mystery of the Silent Watcher was her obsession. One night, after digging through old records, she found something new. A witness statement, hidden away in a forgotten box, revealed something chilling. The Watcher had been seen once, just once, by someone who was lucky enough to survive. The witness described a tall man, dressed in black, with pale skin and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The witness couldn't see his face, but they could feel his presence, watching from the shadows. The strange thing was, this description didn't match the typical profile of a killer. It was as if the Watcher was more than human, an enigma, a force of nature. Determined to uncover more, Lena decided to visit the town's old police chief, a man who had retired after the case went cold. She thought he might know something no one else did. The chief, now in his late 70s, was reluctant to talk at first, But after some coaxing, he told her something she hadn't expected to hear. "There's a pattern," he said, his voice shaking. "The Watcher isn't just a killer, he's a collector. Each victim was chosen for a reason. Something about their lives, their pasts, made them the perfect target." He paused, staring at Lena with a haunted look in his eyes. "But there's more. The Watcher doesn't just take lives, he leaves behind something else." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, something else?" she asked, leaning forward. The chief hesitated, then leaned in closer. Each time the bodies were arranged in a specific way. A pattern, a message, but no one ever figured it out. He paused again, his voice barely a whisper. "It's like he's sending a message to someone, and that someone—" He trailed off. Lena pressed him further, but the chief clammed up. He seemed afraid of something. "I can't help you anymore," he said, standing abruptly. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Lena left his office, feeling more unsettled than ever. She knew she was getting closer to something big, but the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. That night, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was the same unease she'd felt during her investigation, but stronger now, more real. She kept the lights on and locked the doors, but as she lay in bed, she heard something. A faint sound outside her window, a scratch, slow and deliberate. Her heart raced as she crept to the window, but there was nothing, just the darkened street, empty and silent. She breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling didn't go away. It clung to her, a presence she couldn't explain. The Watcher wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was real, and he was still out there. The next day, Lena decided to visit the places where the victims had been found, hoping to uncover some clue. As she walked through the town, she noticed something strange. People were watching her, not just glances, but fixed stares, as if they knew something she didn't. She felt a chill run down her spine. At the first crime scene, she found the remains of a house that had been abandoned for years. It had burned down, the walls charred and blackened. But as she explored, she found something odd, a small piece of fabric, torn and stained with blood. It was a clue. But it wasn't like anything from the victim's clothing. It seemed out of place. Lena took the fabric and left, but as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every car behind her seemed to match her speed, always too close, always too silent. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just paranoia. But deep down, she knew she wasn't alone. That night, Lena received an anonymous letter. It was simple, just a few words. "You're getting too close." Her blood ran cold as she realized the letter had been left in her mailbox, without anyone seeing. It was a warning. She knew that now. Someone didn't want her digging into the past. But who? The next day, Lena received a phone call. It was an unmarked number. She hesitated before picking up. "Hello?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was no answer at first, only the sound of breathing on the other end. Then, a low, rasping voice spoke, sending a chill through her body. "You're close," the voice said. "You're almost there, but you'll never find me. Not now, not ever." The line went dead. Lena's hand trembled as she held the phone. The Watcher was toying with her, playing a game. She had to find him, or the game would be over, but she didn't know if she was ready for what she might uncover. As the days passed, Lena's obsession grew. She dug deeper, following every lead, every scrap of information. But the more she found, the more she realized the Watcher's pattern wasn't just random. It was deliberate. The victims had something in common. They had all been involved in some kind of crime, a hidden past that no one knew about. One name stood out to her. A man named Paul Mercer. He had been a local businessman, respected by everyone, until he vanished without a trace 10 years ago. His disappearance was linked to one of the murders, but no one had ever connected the dots, until now. Lena visited Mercer's old office, hoping to find something that would explain his connection to the Watcher. As she searched through the dusty files, she found something disturbing. Mercer had been involved in a series of shady deals, including illegal trafficking. The deeper she dug, the darker the story became. But just as she was about to leave, Lena found something else. A photograph, buried under a stack of old papers. It showed Paul Mercer standing with a man she didn't recognize. The man's face was obscured, but his eyes, they glowed in the dim light, the same way the Watchers had been described. Lena's heart stopped. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The Watcher wasn't just a killer. He was connected to the town's darkest secrets. He had been watching them all along. But why? What had happened all those years ago that had triggered this killing spree? And what was his true motive? Lena felt her pulse race. She was getting closer, but she could feel the danger mounting. The Watcher knew she was onto him, and he wouldn't let her uncover the truth without a price. That night she had a nightmare. She saw Mercer's face twisted in agony as he reached out to her from a dark, endless void. When Lena woke up, she found that her office had been ransacked. Her notes, her research, everything was gone. Someone had been inside while she slept. She was no longer just investigating the case. She was part of it. The Watcher knew who she was, and he was watching her every move. Lena decided to confront the chief again. She needed answers, but when she arrived at his house, it was empty. There was no sign of life, just an eerie silence. She called out for him, but there was no reply. As she turned to leave, she saw something in the corner of her eye, a shadow moving. The figure stepped out from the darkness, and Lena froze. It was the chief, but he was different. His eyes were hollow, his face pale. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. His lips trembled as he whispered, "He's coming. It's too late now. You're too late." Then he collapsed, lifeless, at her feet. Lena stumbled back in horror, her mind racing. She couldn't understand what was happening. The Watcher was closer now, more real than ever. She ran, desperate to escape. But as she reached the door, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps following her. She fled into the night, but the shadows seemed to close in around her. Everywhere she turned, she saw movement, heard whispers. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had to make it out, had to survive, but she knew deep down that the Watcher was already waiting for her. Suddenly a figure appeared in front of her, tall, thin, with glowing eyes. It was him, the Watcher. Lena screamed, but it was too late. Before she could react, the figure reached out, and everything went black. The next morning, Lena's body was found in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The town was in shock, but no one could explain what had happened. The police couldn't find any leads, and the case remained unsolved. The Watcher had claimed another victim, and his presence was still felt in the town. But Lena's investigation didn't end there. As the months passed, strange things began happening. People started disappearing again. The Watcher was back, and this time, he wasn't going to stop until every secret was uncovered.